had spent the entire morning excited, carefully choosing the dress I knew he loved, picking out the flowers that had once made his eyes light up, and rehearsing the toast I wanted to make for our anniversary. Everything felt perfect, or at least it should have. When I arrived at the restaurant, the soft glow of the candles and the familiar hum of our favorite song playing in the background should have made me feel safe, cherished, like I mattered. Instead, the moment I saw him sitting across the table with that smug, unreadable expression, my stomach dropped. He didn't rise to greet me. He simply reached into his jacket pocket and slid an envelope across the table, his eyes glinting with a kind of cruel satisfaction I had never expected. Confusion paralyzed me. I picked up the envelope, my fingers trembling, and for a second, the world seemed to tilt. Inside were divorce papers. My pulse raced. My mind refused to comprehend. Why now? Why like this? Every slight, every snub, every time he had praised my spouse's sibling over me suddenly made sense. I had always been the quiet, overlooked one, the one whose sacrifices went unnoticed, while favoritism painted the rest of our lives in stark, unbearable contrast. I wanted to speak, to demand an explanation, but my voice dissolved into the void of humiliation. Around us, the chatter of other diners blurred into a distant hum, and I felt entirely alone. My heart ached, not just from the shock of the papers, but from the weight of every past indignity, every invisible line drawn in favor of someone else. I forced a calm I didn't feel, sliding the envelope back toward him with a trembling hand. My eyes locked on his, daring him to break the smile that was cutting deeper than any words could. The evening that was meant to celebrate love had transformed into a study of betrayal, a mirror showing exactly how little I mattered in the hierarchy of this family. And yet, somewhere beneath the shock and humiliation, a spark ignited, whispering that this moment, as cruel as it was, might be the beginning of something entirely unexpected. I couldn't stop thinking about all the little ways I had been overlooked, dismissed, and quietly shoved aside over the years. At every holiday, my spouse's sibling always got the grander gifts, the glowing praise, the attention that I silently craved but never received. When my parents-in-law handed over that inheritance after my spouse's graduation, I received a polite nod, while my sibling-in-law received the check, the car, and the applause. I had smiled, congratulated them, and swallowed the bitterness that knotted my stomach, convincing myself it wasn't about money. It was about recognition, about being seen. And yet every slight had left its mark. I remembered the countless dinners where my suggestions were dismissed, my opinions treated like background noise, the subtle jabs disguised as jokes, and the way everyone seemed to assume I was less capable, less deserving, less me. I had given so much of myself for this family, helping with every chaotic holiday, covering mistakes that weren't mine, smoothing tensions that weren't mine, but it had never been enough. They didn't see the sleepless nights, the sacrifices, the silent support I had poured into keeping everything together. And now, with the envelope in front of me, all of those memories came crashing back, coiling around my heart like a vice. I forced my face into a neutral mask, hiding the boiling anger beneath, carefully folding away the hurt and humiliation into a compartment of my mind I rarely opened. But beneath that calm exterior, a thought began to take root, a careful, deliberate plan. If they thought this was the end, that I would crumble quietly like I always had, they were about to learn just how wrong they were. I started noticing things I had ignored before. The little tells that revealed who he really was. The way my father-in-law's eyes darted over the room whenever someone else spoke. The way he leaned back with that smug posture, as if the world itself owed him respect. He controlled conversations, decided who spoke, who laughed, who mattered, and I had spent years quietly absorbing it, pretending it didn't sting. Sitting there at the dinner table, I watched him berate the waiter for the slightest delay, commanding my spouse with a tone that brooked no disagreement, and I felt a familiar mix of frustration and clarity. I realized he had underestimated me my entire life, assuming I would bend, smile, and endure silently. And for the first time, I allowed myself to acknowledge a dangerous thought. If he thought I was weak, predictable, and pliable, that was exactly the misconception I could exploit. I replayed the years of slighted opportunities, the small injustices, and began to calculate quietly. Every overlooked moment, every dismissal, every sneer he had directed my way was a tiny misstep, a brick in the foundation of his eventual undoing. I didn't speak. I didn't move. I simply observed, learning the rhythm of his arrogance, memorizing the patterns that had allowed him to dominate every interaction. And somewhere deep inside, a seed of power took root. If he wanted to treat me like I didn't exist, fine, I would exist, on my own terms, and in ways he could never anticipate. It happened almost by accident. While tidying up some old papers I had kept for years, I stumbled across a document tucked away in a folder I hadn't touched since moving in. At first, I didn't think much of it. A seemingly mundane property agreement, buried in legal jargon that most people would glance over and discard. But as I read, the implications hit me like a punch I had been waiting for without knowing it existed. My father-in-law had assumed he had complete control, that every asset, every financial maneuver, and every family advantage was entirely in his grasp. What he hadn't realized was that a loophole, a neglected clause, or a poorly worded agreement could shift everything in my favor. I felt a rush of adrenaline, the first flicker of excitement in weeks. The power dynamics I had once thought unchangeable suddenly seemed flexible, malleable, and entirely within reach. I didn't announce anything. I didn't gloat. I simply absorbed the knowledge, letting it settle in my mind while the world carried on around me. The first subtle reversal had begun. I had leverage he would never suspect, and I intended to use it carefully, like a surgeon wielding a scalpel. I imagined the moment when this hidden advantage would quietly tip the scales, when his smug confidence would falter without him understanding why. For the first time since that cursed envelope arrived, I felt the tide shifting. I was no longer merely reacting to his cruelty. I was positioning myself to change the narrative entirely, and that knowledge burned with an intoxicating mix of suspense, anticipation, and quiet satisfaction. The next family gathering felt like walking into a carefully staged play, where I was always cast as the invisible extra. My father-in-law floated through the room with his usual smug charm, lavishing attention on my spouse's sibling, praising them for accomplishments I had quietly helped them achieve. Every compliment he threw their way felt like a slap against my own invisible face, and the subtle jabs, mocking my choices, mispronouncing my achievements, or cutting me off mid-sentence, were aimed to remind everyone who held the real power. I smiled, nodded, and laughed at the right moments, concealing the fire building inside me, the storm I was beginning to summon in silence. Each toast, each handshake, each public correction of my words layered tension upon tension, and I could feel the eyes of cousins and friends shifting, noticing the imbalance without saying it aloud. And as I stood there, sipping my drink and listening to him boast about his dominance, a quiet thought formed, one I could barely let myself dwell on. He would not see the next move coming. I allowed a small, almost imperceptible smile to creep onto my face, masking the brewing plan that would turn the world upside down for him. Beneath my calm, beneath the decorum I had mastered over years of being underestimated, a reckoning was quietly taking shape. Soon, he would learn that the person he had spent a lifetime dismissing was no longer invisible. For the first time, I approached my situation not as a victim, but as a player with the board laid out before me. Every meeting, every casual conversation, every passing glance became an opportunity to gather information, to test the boundaries of his arrogance. I quietly reviewed the documents I had discovered, consulting experts and advisors who never suspected the real story behind my sudden attentiveness. Socially, I began repositioning myself, subtly building alliances with family friends and colleagues who had long admired my diligence but were blinded by my father-in-law's favoritism. Financially, I arranged small but deliberate moves, leveraging accounts and contracts in ways that, on the surface, seemed innocent, harmless even. But in reality, they edged me closer to the first tangible advantage I could claim. Every evening, I sat alone, reviewing each step, replaying interactions in my mind, and calculating the precise moment when my patience would pay off. I reminded myself that he thrived on haste, on visible dominance, and that my strength lay in quiet precision. Near the end of one long night, I smiled at the thought of the first power reversal I had already set in motion. A subtle, Invisible checkmate that would leave him wondering how someone he had always dismissed had grown so untouchable. The anticipation coiled in my chest, sharp and delicious, a promise of the reckoning to come. That night, I couldn't shake the heaviness in my chest. The excitement of the plan collided with the fear of exposure, and I found myself questioning everything. Was I strong enough to see this through? Could I endure the shame if it backfired? I called my closest friend, needing to hear a voice that wasn't laced with judgment. I just don't know if I can do this, I admitted, my voice trembling. Everything feels so fragile. One mistake, and it all comes crashing down. They were silent for a moment before replying softly. You've been underestimating yourself your whole life. You've survived every slight, every humiliation. If anyone can turn this around, it's you. Later I spoke with my spouse, who sensed my unease. You're carrying so much, they said gently. But you're not alone. Whatever happens, I'm with you. I sank into the weight of their words, feeling both supported and vulnerable. Alone later, I stared at the documents and social connections I'd been cultivating, questioning if my patience could withstand the storm. The fear of discovery, the possibility of misstep gnawed at me, and yet beneath the anxiety, a stubborn ember of determination glowed. I couldn't give up now. Not when the first real hints of justice were so close. At the charity gala, he strutted around like a king in his domain, commanding attention with every exaggerated gesture, every boastful anecdote about his wealth and influence. He laughed loudly at jokes, interrupted conversations, and flung compliments at my spouse's sibling with a casual arrogance that made my blood boil. Nobody noticed me, or at least they pretended not to, and that was exactly how I wanted it. Every smirk, every self-congratulatory glance he threw carried the unspoken message. He believed he was untouchable, that no one could challenge his authority. He had no idea who he was messing with. I lingered in the background, observing, noting every flaw in his grand performance, every moment of overconfidence, every opportunity he inadvertently left exposed. My pulse quickened not from fear, but from anticipation, the thrill of the storm I was preparing. The envelope he had handed me weeks ago now felt like a symbol of my patience and cunning. Soon, he would discover that the quiet, underestimated figure standing at the edge of the room had been plotting meticulously, and when the moment came, the revelation would be explosive. I let my gaze linger on him, smiling faintly. He thought he was untouchable. He was about to be very, very wrong. I arrived early at the law firm, my heart hammering with a mix of nerves and exhilaration. My father-in-law would be here any moment, expecting to assert dominance, expecting me to squirm under the weight of his theatrics. As I sat in the polished conference room, I rehearsed my words silently, recalling every slight, every dismissive glance, every underhanded move he had made over the years. When he finally strode in, perfectly coiffed and radiating smug confidence, I greeted him calmly, my voice steady, my expression neutral. "Good morning," I said, and he blinked, just slightly unsettled by the composure he hadn't anticipated. The lawyers began the formalities, reading clauses, reviewing signatures, and he leaned back in his chair, certain of victory. I listened, responding only when necessary, each word measured, each gesture deliberate. He didn't notice the subtle cues I had planted, the documents I had organized to shift leverage subtly in my favor. My spouse sat beside me, nodding discreetly, understanding the gravity of the moment and the delicate timing required. As he started to boast about his perceived control over the estate and his family, I allowed a tiny, almost imperceptible smile to cross my lips. I had anticipated every angle, every assumption he relied upon. The tension in the room became electric. Every eye on us, every word spoken heightened the suspense. He had walked in expecting humiliation for me, not realizing that the trap had already been set and the tide was about to turn. The payoff was imminent, and I could feel it coiling, ready to strike. When the moment came, the room held its breath. My father-in-law, brimming with confidence, leaned back in his chair, convinced he had orchestrated yet another victory over me. I slid the envelope across the polished conference table, deliberately slow, watching his eyes follow it with curiosity, then suspicion. Inside were documents he had never anticipated. Legal filings that reversed control of key assets, proof of mismanaged accounts, and a public declaration that exposed the favoritism and manipulation he had relied on for decades. As he flipped through the pages, the color drained from his face, his smug grin replaced by disbelief. I spoke calmly, measured, each word punctuated with the weight of every slight he had ever inflicted. I've preserved everything carefully, exactly as it should be. And now it's all in order, on my terms. Gasps rippled through the room. Witnesses, lawyers, and family members stared, realizing the magnitude of what had just unfolded. Social media notifications buzzed as I discreetly signaled my spouse to post the evidence to the channels where it could no longer be ignored, amplifying the public humiliation. Every microaggression, every dismissive gesture he had ever made now seemed trivial compared to the sheer magnitude of his reversal. I had transformed years of quiet suffering into a spectacle of justice, and the shock in his eyes was a visual confirmation of every calculated step I had taken. As I collected myself, letting the silence settle like a tangible weight, I felt a rush of catharsis. For the first time in years, I was seen, acknowledged, and untouchable, while he, the man who had thrived on dominance and dismissal, was left speechless, exposed, and utterly defeated. Sitting alone later that evening, I let the events of the day wash over me, my chest finally easing from the tension that had gripped it for so long. The satisfaction wasn't loud or triumphant. It was quiet, deep, and wholly mine. I thought about the years of dismissal, the subtle humiliations, and the moments when I had been overlooked or underestimated. Now everything had shifted. My father-in-law's presence no longer carried the weight of authority. His gaze, once commanding, was hesitant, unsure. Family members approached me differently, some with cautious admiration, others with whispered apologies for having failed to notice before. Even my spouse's sibling, previously the favored one, looked at me with newfound respect, perhaps finally understanding the strength I had quietly carried all along. I allowed myself a small, reflective smile, acknowledging the complex mix of emotions. Justice had been served, but at a cost that left lingering tension. The envelope, once a symbol of threat and humiliation, had become a testament to patience, intelligence, and moral perseverance. I realized I had not only reclaimed my dignity, but I had shifted the family's entire dynamic. My father-in-law, still speechless, understood that his attempts to dominate and belittle had failed, and that realization alone was its own reward. In this quiet aftermath, I felt a balance restored, a personal empowerment solidified, and an emotional satisfaction that resonated far deeper than any public spectacle could have achieved. Later, as I sat in the quiet of my own home, away from the judgments and whispers, I let myself reflect on everything that had transpired. The anniversary that had begun with betrayal and humiliation had transformed into a personal journey of empowerment and self-realization. I thought back to the envelope, the subtle manipulations, and the years of being overlooked, and realized that every slight had taught me patience, strategy, and the value of knowing my own worth. For the first time, I truly understood that control had never been in his hands. It had been within me all along, waiting for the right moment to be claimed. I smiled at the contrast between who I had been at the start of this journey, naive, underestimated, silenced, and the person I had become, composed, deliberate, and fiercely respected. The lessons lingered. Never underestimate the quiet. Never. Dismiss the one who appears powerless, and always trust your own judgment and strength. That initial betrayal, once a source of pain, had become the catalyst for growth, and the memory of it no longer stung. It guided me. In that reflection, I felt an enduring sense of self-worth, an inner peace, and a renewed command over my life, leaving me both proud and quietly triumphant, ready for whatever came next. Just as I thought the storm had settled, a subtle message arrived that made me pause. It wasn't from my father-in-law, nor from anyone I expected. It was from an old family friend, someone who had quietly observed everything over the years. The note contained a photograph, a document, and a brief line. "There's more than you know." My heart skipped a beat. A previously hidden property, a secret inheritance, or perhaps a long-buried scandal. The possibilities raced through my mind. I smiled, the thrill of discovery igniting a familiar fire. The game wasn't over. There were still layers to uncover, challenges to face, and victories to claim. It was a subtle reminder that life, like family, always held hidden depths. And as I tucked the message away, a quiet excitement coursed through me. The story wasn't finished, and for the first time in years, the future felt like mine entirely, full of opportunity, suspense, and the promise of justice yet to come. I stood by the window of my apartment, the city lights stretching endlessly below, and let myself savor the quiet triumph. No one was watching, no one applauding. This victory was mine alone, untainted by the chaos of their judgments or the shadows of past slights. The envelope, the meetings, the careful maneuvers, they had all led here, to a moment of complete control over my own life. I reflected on how far I had come, from overlooked, underestimated, and dismissed, to someone who had turned humiliation into empowerment, patience into strategy, and pain into purpose. The satisfaction wasn't in proving anyone else wrong. It was in proving to myself that I was stronger, smarter, and unshakable. I whispered to no one in particular, a quiet affirmation of everything I had reclaimed. They thought they could break me, but they only made me unstoppable. And in that declaration, I felt a clarity I had never known before. The past no longer had power. The future was mine to shape. And karma, finally, had been delivered in full.